Welcome to Disrupting Peace, a show about why peace hasn't worked and how it still could. I'm Bridget Conley, Research Director at the World Peace Foundation. This season, we're focusing on the first steps that everyday people can take towards peace. So, how can people support their neighbors and community when a war breaks out? Today, we're seeing what we can learn from mutual aid efforts in Sudan. Omar al-Bashir ruled Sudan for 3 brutal decades, from 1989 until he was overthrown by a peaceful revolution in 2019. In 2023, a civil war broke out between two warring parties, the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. Community members leveraged mutual aid networks to meet the survival needs of everyday people. These networks are called emergency response rooms, not to be confused with a hospital emergency room. To learn more, I'm speaking with Omima Jabal and Alex Duvall. Omima is a leader in the emergency response rooms, or ERRs, in Sudan's capital of Khartoum. She initiated the Infinitive of Teaching English Language program, which allowed around 500 people to study English despite living in a war zone. Sudan's emergency response rooms have been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize this year. Alex Duvall is executive director of my organization, the World Peace Foundation, and among the world's leading experts on the Horn of Africa, which includes Sudan. In the past, he worked with the African Union on peace negotiations in Sudan, including in Darfur. Together, we'll explore how Omima and her community responded in the first hours of the war, the unique impact of emergency response rooms compared to international humanitarian aid, and why these efforts play a key role in peace building. You'll hear us say ERR throughout the conversation. ERR refers to these grassroots mutual aid networks, emergency response rooms. That's ERR, emergency response rooms. All right, here's the conversation. Alex, Omima, welcome to Disrupting Peace.
It's great to be with you.
It's very nice to be with you.
So I wanted to start by asking you about your personal recollections. Omima, do you remember where you were and what happened when the war broke out in Khartoum on April 15th, 2023?
Oh, yeah. Well, it was like one of the most greatest Ramadan that we spent it. We were very happy. I'm not gonna lie. I was very happy at that time. I was in a gathering with my friends. We spent the night talking and just having a very great time. After that, I came back home around 2 a.m. In the morning and I slept. Then I woke up and there was like sounds of bombing and fire. Just my mom came and said that there is a sound of gunfire outside. I was like, "You must be kidding, mom." She said, "No, I'm not."
And so on that morning that you talked about waking up and in realizing that war had come, how did you start engaging in mutual aid for your community?
At the first, we all been in shock, but directly after, maybe 2 hours from the gun firing and so on, we made a calls to each other. When I say each other, we already had a community-based work. So we had this project been going on since 2019. It was working on community development as general and also raising awarenesses. And we succeeded in establishing more than 5 libraries, including 2 of them were dedicated to the children.
Amima, the work you're describing was part of the 2019 civilian led peaceful revolution in Sudan, right? Can you give us a short background on the revolution?
It was a revolution led by a youth and the young people in Sudan who had a dream of having a better future for the upcoming generations. During 2018, 2019, we had one of the greatest sit-in at the army headquarters. It lasted for 50 something days. And after that, people been evacuated from it by forest and many people died, many young people died, and we've been through a lot of shit since then. So the revolution basically it took over the old regime, al-Bashir regime, after 30 years something. And then at 2019, we had a kind of an agreement talking about transitional period. It was an agreement between the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, which is RSF.
So during this transition period, then, these two armed groups backed down. They allowed a civilian led government to take over, and it looked like the peaceful pro democracy uprising of 2019 succeeded. Alex, how did this eventually give way to the outbreak of war?
General Abdel Fattah al Burhan of the SAF and General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti of the RSF, jointly mounted a coup and removed the not very effective civilian government and killed off the transition to democracy. And these two men could not then agree who was to be the boss. And they had taken control of not only the government, but also the economy. And what we see in this war is something that is quite distinct from previous wars. Previous wars were described as wars of vision, in which the contending parties had different visions of what Sudan would be, whether it would be an Islamic state or a secular state, a state built upon an Arab Islamic identity or on a multi ethnic identity. Neither of the warring parties have any vision for the future other than defeating the other, enriching themselves, and grabbing whatever power they can.
Amima, let's return to the night that the war broke out. After you got over the shock, what did you do?
So after 2 hours of the war, we started calling each other, the youth who've been involved in this community work. We talked about what we can do. That was the question. And we started to kind of coordinate with each other among each neighborhood and just to trying to work on three basic things, which is checking the available resources, what type of the food supply that we have, how we can manage to spend them during the upcoming days, because we been know that the upcoming days will not be easy. And also we're trying to work on the medication, on the available pharmacies, trying to create a kind of a link with those pharmacies owners in order to having like a kind of a stock for the medication and first aid materials. Also, we started to count among our neighborhoods the number of the elderly who are sick and the children. So this is the first thing we did in the early 2 hours. So by the end of the first day, we already had an idea what we have, what kind of material we have, but we needed to set a plan how we are going to manage all these resources.
So, what did you do next?
At the third day, we decided that we need to reorganize and reactivating our emergency room. It's been established since 2018, but it was only working during the bad times like the COVID-19 pandemic. So we had a calls and we gathered at our central hospital in the area where I live. We sit there and we're trying to talk about different scenarios, worst scenarios, in order to know how we can deal with them. And from that place, we started to think that we need all to be together. At the neighborhood levels, we need to have a kind of level of coordination and linkages between the different citizens in order to know how we can survive. And at the same time, we ourselves, we needed to work together. We need to work on our networks in order to get that type of support and bond.
So, there was already grassroots community work happening in your area before the war broke out in 2023. Can you say more about that?
After the revolution in 2019, we started to work on a community development project. We assigned it to work for 3 years, basically in order to improve our community. At that time, we didn't call it an ERR, we was call it a body. It was just a body where we all sit together. We had a representative from all the neighborhoods, literally all the neighborhoods. We have like more than 100 neighborhoods. And we just came and talking about what we need and how we are going to implement these things and so on. So when we tried this, we find it was very, very effective for us. Each activity was accountable to the community itself. So the motifs and the drive were coming from us because we love our area. We really wanted to pursue that change in our area. When a person comes to be a volunteer, they are giving us their times. They're giving us their effort in order to managing these things.
So, mutual aid, what you talked about was taking stock of what was immediate and waking up your network. How is mutual aid different from humanitarian relief, right? That comes from the outside. And I guess one of the things I really wanted to know about it, what are the risks and advantages to working within your own community?
What's the difference between the mutual aid and the humanitarian aid as general? Usually the humanitarian aid is identified by the international community, then after that executed by a non-governmental organizational or initiatives or national groups at the level of a country that's targeted by the aids itself. Those bodies who are only implementing the aid, they have no right in order to just identify is the aid that they're receiving, is it what the community need, and so on. On the same time, the mutual aid, it's an idea started with the community itself. That's mean the community decided their own needs and decided the best way how they can implement it. And in my opinion, why mutual aid at that time of war done? There is like a set of reasons. At the first, the only fund that was available for the emergency responses room and grassroots groups to work with was the fund that we received by the Sudanese diaspora. And we have this kind of a ritual in our culture when we have the sons and daughters and the people from a certain neighborhood, when they are staying outside with a better economical situation, they usually do support their neighborhood somehow. So when the war started, our prime source of fund was those Sudanese diaspora. That was the first reason. The other thing is the calls were blocked out, and already we had no contact with the people from even the neighboring area.
So, how did you all communicate and coordinate with each other if calls weren't possible?
On the ground, it was the Starlink. They were using the Starlink to connect it to the internet in order to get in touch and receive the aids and all the other things.
It's Elon Musk's satellite.
Also, being widely used in the Ukrainian war, I believe.
Yeah. I think one of the things that was very striking in those first weeks in the war was the extent to which the Sudanese within Khartoum and other cities and the Sudanese in the diaspora were able to improvise all sorts of mechanisms for communicating with each other using satellite phones, sending money, because there were still some electronic banking routes available for getting money to Sudan, and whereby people could actually buy their groceries and things like that. Whereas the international organizations, the United Nations, USAID, the big NGOs, were very slow and cumbersome in responding. And actually, they evacuated their staff. That was the key thing that focused the attention of the international community, was getting their people out of harm's way, even while the Sudanese were being left to cope with the enormous deluge of harm that was breaking over their heads.
As the war started, the international community and the international INGOs and bodies, they all left. They were like no one in order just to provide this aid in any term.
Oh, Mima, was there more you wanted to say about the difference between mutual aid and humanitarian aid?
Yes, the last thing, which is the most important thing, the youth and the young people, they have access to the community itself, and they already gained the trust of the community. So no matter where you are, if you are a young person who has like the experiences during the revolution and the years after that up to the war, you have a kind of a trust by the community itself. Because as I told you, we had a lot of project working with the community directly even before the war. So the trust was one of the reason. The fund itself was coming through the Sudanese diaspora, which is they are Sudanese. The other thing, the international community has no access. So this was the only option in order just to having this kind of aid. And at that time, we didn't even call it a mutual aid. Mutual aid is like, it's a new word. But at that time, the international community abandoned us during this time. So it's only us. It's only two options. We take a lead and trying to support our people and our community, or we all die. This was the conversation. This was the like the comparison.
So, for you, there was no real other choice.
Yeah, there were no other choice.
Was the work that you were doing with the ERRs, either for you or for your colleagues, what kinds of risks did you have to take to maintain that network?
There's a lot of risk, actually. There's the personal risks. A volunteer could be arrested. Some of our volunteers, they actually been kidnapped, some of them been threatened, other being killed. And it was very hard trying to work with all these risks and losing the volunteers. Adding to this, the economical Risk also was one of the basic challenges because most of the volunteers, they were the youth who were supporting their own families. The other risk is regarding to the women within the ERRs. It was the risk of movement. It was very difficult for women to move around easily because of the violence, because of the raping. So many girls were not getting that enough space in order to participate.
So, what are some ways that women were able to get involved despite these risks?
We've been very sure that you are not moving alone. We are moving with the company of maybe a family member or sometimes a friend or something like that. The other thing, we're trying to create that techniques where we are moving in groups. For me, it was like one of the saving mechanism. The other part is like how we trying to involve the women in the ERR works, and in the same time trying to keep them safe. Most of the time, we gave the women the technical work. For example, writing the reports and trying to communicate. That was at the first days. But later, with the women and girls safe spaces and children safe spaces, they were not kind of that activities. Might be suspicious for anything. It was like usually about having a coffee together with the women, just trying to maybe crafting. So it was even safer because even the space will be within the neighborhood. So they don't have to move along and they don't have to move too far in order just to implement any kind of things. So we took these simple actions in order just to make sure that women would be okay among the ERRs.
So, Amima, as the war continued and the ERRs were able to grow, I think, or maybe you can tell us what happened to them over time. I'm also curious in your reflections on the relationship between this mutual aid project that you played such a key role in and the future of Sudan.
When the ERR started, they were not talking about what we will have in the future. They were only focusing on we need to provide the services for our communities. We need to make sure that those communities are going to survive the war. But as the ERR implemented, one of the most important impact of the ERRs is like it works on the communal cohesion and some activities of the ERRs, they actually contribute to the peace building process, like the women and girls safe spaces, because there is a psychosocial support and it's a safe space for all different components of the community, no matter where they are coming from, as long as they are part of this community. The ERRs, they are establishing for the future of the Sudan.
So, can you say more about how they're establishing the future of Sudan?
Maybe we will have a leaders from the ERRs because ERRs is very connected to the community. They understand the needs of the community, and this always been the gap between the community and politicians. They don't engage with their communities in order to understand what exactly a community needs. The ERR has this privilege. The other thing is like the ERR actually working on the roots of communities, which is mean that they're working from the scratch. They are trying to effect it from the scratch, and not just that with all the other work that the ERR do, a community is been practicing a way of how they can say that this is our need and how to implement this need. So it was a kind of a training for them in order to know that they have a right to say what we need, and they have also the right to identify the gaps exactly they are facing. The other thing, now they have a very, very great coordination levels with the different international community and even Sudanese civil society organization. That's mean you are going to fill in the gaps that the community identified. It allows also to exchange the knowledge, exchange the capacities. And so we will have, I think that we will have in the future like a more solid plans for what we want as a Sudanese. We will have like a more solid plan of how we can get what we want. This is the gap, as I said, between the politician and the community themselves.
So, Amima, you've described the emergency response rooms as essentially democracy in practice. Alex, do you want to say anything more about how they functioned?
So I think it's important to go back and think about, reflect upon how that non-violent civic revolution was enacted 6 years ago. And the core of it was neighborhood committees, people organizing below the political horizon at a very local level, using their own resources and their networks, and mobilizing against an authoritarian regime that was determined to destroy them. And when the war broke out, in April of 2023, those same networks, very often those same committees, came together and they reconstituted themselves with this humanitarian community support mandate. There was quite some debate as to whether they should take a political role. But my understanding is that most of them said, we can't do that because neither of these warring parties would tolerate that. And so the emergency response rooms, which emerged organically from this process, represent that tradition, that lineage of community mobilizing. And I think just as they took 5, 6, 7 years of underground mobilization before they could enact the nonviolent revolution against Omar al-Bashir, it may be that they will take just as long before they can really come out into the sunlight and assert themselves as truly political actors.
I was just asking if it's possible for me to add something.
Of course it is. Yeah.
Okay, currently, the ERRs, they are neutral body. They are only focusing on the humanitarian work. There's a set of challenges that they are facing right now. The ERR are not registered, they will not be registered. So one of the current challenge that related to the managerial capacities, the ERR need to build the capacities of the volunteers and also the fund. I think with the shortage of funds and the capacity gap, it's very difficult for ERR to create strategic, impactful actions. Most of the impactful of the ERR, they came indirectly, they were not planned. But within this situation, I think the ERR need to be planned.
Let me make a point on that too. The international humanitarian system is in crisis. USAID has been massively cut. The funds to the UN system are hugely reduced. This is a tremendous problem for Sudan, but there is also an opportunity lurking in there, which is that the old style of system, relying very heavily on these international institutions that are very infrastructure heavy, is expensive and inefficient. The emergency response rooms are much more efficient, much more flexible, much more adaptable. Money directed to them is far better spent. The problem is that they don't actually fill out the kinds of forms that will satisfy the auditors in Washington, D.C., or in Brussels, or in London. So this is an opportunity. If international aid donors are genuine about getting more value for their dollars, to switch out from this old system into directly funding grassroots initiatives such as the emergency response rooms.
Thank you. Omima, Alex, I have one final question, and it's something that we do at the end of every episode, and we call it collective dreaming. So Sudan gained its independence in 1956. Since then, it has experienced 7 coups and decades of war, including famine and genocide. But in the long span of history, 70 years is really not that long. So if you can imagine 70 years into the future, so pretend it's the year 2095, Sudan is at peace with itself and its neighbors. Its government is focused on all its people's well-being. What do we need to do today in order to get to that future? Alex, I'm going to start with you, and you can also contest the we.
So I think the most wonderful quality that the Sudanese have is the capacity to have a conversation, the capacity to talk to one another across all those political divides. And I think of Sudan not as any sort of finished business, but as an unfinished, ongoing civic conversation. What worries me most at the moment is the degree of polarization that we see among not the military, but among the civilian groups, especially on social media. And I think if the Sudanese can overcome that, then I think we can weave together the fabric of a civic, ongoing, never finished, but hopeful, collectively owned Sudan.
Omima, you get the last word. So what do we, and we can include you, the Sudanese people, the international community, whoever you want, what do we need to do today to get to this more peaceful future?
The first part is like the international community. I think the international community need to use their accessibility more in order to push the conflict parties to sit in and trying to figure out a way of at least stopping the gunfires. And yeah, and at the same time, trying to coordinate more with the Sudanese society, civil society, whether they are a grassroots movement bodies or they are civil society Sudanese organization. On the other hand, as a Sudanese, we do understand that these issues in the first point is a Sudanese problem. So I think as a Sudanese, we need to work together. That's the first thing. Starting with accepting each other and trying to talk to understand each other. I mean, geographically, psychologically, conceptually, just trying to create that base for all of us that we are agreed on it in order to move on with our dream. And also, we need to work on our willingness. The question is, are we willing to have that Sudan we talk about, a one country full of peace and so on? And this is a question on the first glance, politician, those are the people who need to answer this question. Does they have the willingness in order to create that Sudan? And as the youth and young people, we hope that someday we will have a Sudan that we are dreamed of. We do understand that our future has gone, but for the upcoming generations, we will make sure that they will have a Sudan that really going to meet their own dreams, because we are the one who didn't get that opportunity. We are the one who lost our friends because we are just protesting. We are the one who been suffering and being accused and being arrested and being killed during this war just because we are doing a humanitarian work. So that's all if I can say what we needed to do now in order to have that Sudan we talk about in the future.
Omima, thank you so much, not only for those comments, but also for the example of bravery that you and your colleagues showed in taking those first steps to create this incredible network of the emergency response rooms. Alex, thank you for also reminding us that there is more work to be done on the political level and also to empower those voices like that of Omima and others who are doing the work. Until then, that beautiful future you've both pointed the way to, I want to thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you. And thank you, Omima.
Thank you so much, Bridget.
I invited Omima and Alex to talk with me because I was curious about the very first steps people can take when war breaks out where they live. Instead, I learned that the first step is to already be engaged in your community. The mutual aid network that Omima is a part of was able to feed people and provide medicine and support during the war because, as she noted, it had already been working in the community and had established trust. So when the war started, they continued to listen and respond to what people said they needed. Thankfully, I do not live in a war zone, but the example of how the ERRs engaged with and listened to other people within their community is one I won't forget. As we record this episode, the war in Sudan continues. We send Omima, her community, and the people of Sudan our hope that they will find peace. When they do, I suspect that the foundation they built through mutual aid will help them to sustain that peace into the future. Thanks for listening to Disrupting Peace. I'm Bridget Conley. You can find out more about Omima Jabal and Alex Duval in the links in our show notes. The Nobel Peace Prize decision will be announced this October. Next week on Disrupting Peace, we're exploring how the youngest generation of American adults, Gen Z, are engaging with democracy.
So often the response to young people is, you're going to change the world. You're our future. And I always whip that back at the person who says it and say, and what are you going to do to help me?
Disrupting Peace is a production of the World Peace Foundation. Find out more at worldpeacefoundation.org. You can find us on Blue Sky at worldpeacefdtn.bsky.social. You can also find us on Instagram at worldpeacefdtn. The show is produced by myself and Emily Shaw. Engineering by Jacob Winnick and Asia Simpson. Marketing and social media by Emily Room. Show artwork by Simon Fung. Special thanks to Jeremy Helton, my colleagues Lisa Avery, B. Arneson, and Alex Duvall, and the team from the Tufts Digital Design Studio, including Kimberly Lynn Ferrero-Arnias and Miles Donovan. Okay, until next time, stay skeptical and hopeful.